When one thinks of enslavement in the colonial era, our mind goes to the African slave trade, but the Native American slave trade also played an important role in the Atlantic world and American history. The 1676 Barbados Act to prohibit New England Indian slave importation did just as the title said, but it didn't want to limit the importation because of humanitarian reasons. When the Spanish landed in Central and South America and began setting up plantations, they needed a labor source, and one of their first attempts to acquire labor was the enslavement of Native Americans. However, they ran into problems enslaving the locals because they were familiar with the area and could easily slip away and disappear into the interior of the continents. Then they started to look elsewhere for laborers, ones that were less likely to run away. It was the English who settled Barbados, and Indian enslavement in Barbados dates back to its founding in 1627, when Captain Henry Powell transported 32 Indians to the island from the Dutch colony of Guyana on the South American coast. These natives had agreed to teach the English how to grow cotton, tobacco, and indigo, and to facilitate trade between Barbados and the mainland colonies, all under the premise of living as free people. Such freedom was short-lived, for sometime after Powell's departure, other Barbadian planters took the Indians by force and made them slaves. By the time those 32 Indians made it to the island, the English had already imported at least 10 African slaves for the purpose of growing cash crops. Once the labor-intensive sugar crop became the focus of English plantations in the Caribbean, the British began a heavy importation of African slaves by the mid-1600s. By the mid-1670s, Barbados' governor, Jonathan Atkins, reported that there were 21,725 white men, women, and children, and 32,473 Africans on the island, meaning that the white population was outnumbered by about 11,000. English policies regarding Indian enslavement were confused and varied. At the broadest official level, there was a general presumption against the enslavement of free peoples that was in the keeping with royal views of the rights of natives more generally. Most English magistrates differentiated between justly and unjustly enslaved Indians, from the English perspective at least. English officials almost universally accepted enslaving Indians in what they believed were just wars, along with purchasing Indians who had been enslaved by other imperial powers, presumably also justly, although they seemed to care less about this distinction once the Indians were already in bondage. In Massachusetts, Indian enslavement except through warfare was at least theoretically outlawed in 1641, as was man-stealing in 1647. The same was generally true in the Caribbean. In July 1667, Governor William Willoughby of Barbados sent 2 New England natives to the magistrates of Massachusetts. Willoughby explained that these natives had been sent to England, taken to Barbados, and sold as slaves. Willoughby somehow caught wind of these events and returned them to New England, profusely apologizing and promising to rectify all abuses. Because of the strong economic ties between New England and the English Caribbean colonies, the sugar plantations of Barbados became the site for selling of Native Americans who New Englanders wanted to get rid of. Indians convicted of committing certain crimes were captured and sold to the island colony. For instance, in 1674, an Indian on Cape Cod named Hoken broke into the house of James Bursell of Yarmouth, thereby adding to a long list of prior offenses, for which he was captured and thrown into prison. When Hoken escaped from jail, stole a horse, threatened several people, and in general disturbed the public peace, Plymouth officials ordered him sold or sent to Barbados for to satisfy his debts and to free the colony from so ill a member, as they said. The Pequot War is really the first time that the New Englanders sold prisoners of war into slavery. That war emerged from a long political economic war fought between the Pequot tribe and the smaller tribes around southern New England. The Pequot, through political maneuvering, intermarriage, and full-scale warfare, had subjugated most of the lower tribes in the Connecticut River Valley so they could gain control of the fur trade. When the English came on the scene, that put the stress on the monopoly that the Pequots had on furs. English traders and fur trappers roamed the areas under Pequot control, and tension grew until a few instances of murder and other crimes committed by colonists and Native Americans escalated into a war. The bloody conflict nearly exterminated the Pequot peoples and did destroy the tribe. Men, women, and children were massacred, but those not killed would be sold as slaves, by the Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay colonies. And then there was King Philip's War that raged from 1675 to 1676. Although most people point to the murder of a Harvard-educated Indian who had converted to Puritanism named John Sassamon by 3 warriors on order from Chief Metacom as why the war started, it was more complicated than that. The war had much more of a background than the death of Sassamon. Encroachment by the English on Native American lands and racist policies by the colonies toward Native Americans laid the groundwork for the war. King Philip, or Chief Metacom of the Wampanoag tribe of Native Americans, led his people in this conflict. It is one of the bloodiest conflicts per capita in American history. At the same time New Englanders were fighting against King Philip, the Barbadians dealt with the possibility of a massive slave revolt. A slave girl named Anna overheard 2 enslaved Africans discussing the merit of a rebellion, and told her owner just 8 days before the rebellion was supposed to take place. Within a few days, approximately 100 accused conspiracy leaders were imprisoned and brought before a hastily assembled court. 17 were immediately found guilty and publicly executed. 6 were burned alive and 11 were beheaded, with their corpses dragged through the streets of Speightstown and burned. 25 more accused conspirators were later executed, while 60 languished in prisons awaiting trial, 5 of whom hanged themselves. That this revolt had been clandestinely planned for 3 years prior to its discovery only added to the insecurity felt by the planters. Knowing the situation around the signing of the 1676 Barbados Act to prohibit New England Indian slave importation makes its passage into law more clear. The Barbadians had narrowly escaped a slave revolt that was planning to kill every white person on the island. The white population of Barbados quickly passed slave codes to limit the gathering locations of slaves and made it a capital punishment to threaten white people, and numerous other laws to restrict the enslaved population's movements to hopefully prevent a slave revolt. The same document prohibited New England Native Americans as slaves from entering the colony. The politicians did not want any slaves to enter the colony that might foment rebellion, and captives of King Philip's War fit that description in their eyes. They did not want slaves with a history of fighting English colonists working on their sugar plantations. Not only did the act prevent their importation, but it called for the expulsion of New England Native American slaves from the island. The law was specific. It did not exclude Indians from other parts of the Americas, just the ones from New England.